The clip you're about to watch is just a portion of a much longer conversation that I have for my Mindshift podcast series, where I usually have about a 2-hour conversation with another content creator in this space. I know not everyone has seen all of those or has watched them all the way through, so when I don't have time to make a video, like today because of Christmas, then I try to show you a section that you may have missed from this particular episode. If you'd like to see the full episode, check the link down below, or there will be a link at the end of the video. Thanks, and without further ado, here you go. Is it your belief here that Jesus thought of himself as the Messiah? And two, I'm just curious with the debate going around lately, what's your opinion on Jesus thinking of himself as the Son of God or God himself?
Well, as to what I think Jesus believed, like if I'm just taking the earliest gospel, Mark, and I'm saying this is probably closest to the original narrative, and if I'm going to take any words of Jesus, I'm going to try to stick to Mark. I think the Jesus of Mark probably sees himself as a messianic figure, but more in tune with, for example, like an adopted son of God, not necessarily an actual born son of God. Like we have this adoptionist type of theology in the Gospel of Mark, where it seems like, it wasn't until his baptism when the dove came over him that there seems to be this status as son. There's no virgin birth in Mark. That seems to be some stuff that was tacked on later. But nonetheless, I mean, you don't need a divine birth or to be the necessarily actual Son of God to be the Messiah, because
that's exactly what I was leading into, not to cut you off, but so many Christians who are not familiar will just assume that the Messiah was always going to be the Son of God. Like it's one and the same to them. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the original Jewish take, that would have been a huge surprise. This was news to them that the Messiah was going to be a literal, what would become Trinity, part of God. It's an important context to understand about what's being written at the time and how it's being understood for what we've had to turn it into in the future.
Right. I agree. And, we get instances both in Samuel, Chronicles, and the Psalms of God referring to both Solomon and David as his son. In fact, Psalm 2, he says, "Tell of the decree of the Lord. He has said to me that you are my son today. I have begotten you." Well, I mean, obviously, King David wasn't born, of a virgin birth via Yahweh. This is this idea that similar to the Egyptian pharaohs, you were selected by God. You were knit in your mother's womb. You were hand selected before your birth to fulfill this role. You were chosen by God. And now that you're in this position of God, you're sitting on God's throne, you are now a son of God, right? And so it's more of an elevated messianic title, I would say, in Mark. But this other facet too, he uses the title Son of Man quite a bit. And I'm inclined to believe that this idea of Jesus thinking he's the Son of Man ties both into the Daniel prophecy, but also I think we would be remiss if we didn't touch a little bit on like the Enochic literature, and especially of the Melchizedek scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a Melchizedek scroll that's very popular that is kind of paralleling what we find in Daniel, where there's a divine figure that's going to come and fight on behalf of the children of God, the sons of righteousness, and defeat the sons of darkness, and is referred to as like a son of man. So there's this huge backstory of Melchizedek where, and you'll find it in Enoch, and you'll find the end point in the Melchizedek scroll where he was born of God, right? He didn't have a physical father. His father was a priest, and his wife became pregnant when the priest was in his times of service, so he wasn't having relations. And so when he finds out his wife is pregnant, he's like, "Oh my gosh, did the Watchers knock up my wife? Because I didn't get her pregnant." So he has this divine birth similar to Jesus. And then when you keep reading, you find out that actually Melchizedek wasn't born once, right? The book of Hebrews picks up on this. Hebrews chapter 7, I believe, picks up on this idea, either 7 or 10. Yes, chapter 7. It says, Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings, and blessed him, and said to Abraham, apportioned 1/10 of everything. His name in the first place means king of righteousness. Next, he is also the king of Salem, that is the king of peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. This is definitely tapping into this lore of Melchizedek, where Melchizedek is this pre-existent figure, similar to like, Enoch became the angel Metatron when he ascended into heaven. There's this guy that just manifests every once in a while in bodily form. And he manifested in Genesis 14. He also manifested, it says, during the time of Noah. And so he also manifested again a third time in the figure of Jesus. So Jesus, the reason why they're trying so hard to tie Jesus to Melchizedek is because they're trying to say that Jesus is not just an ordinary human. He does have some divine status. And we find this idea of like an archangel being like man, being tied to the Son of Man in Daniel 7, seems to all be mixing these ideas. But the question is, who is the Son of Man really? What we know is that he's a pre-existent figure that gets born on the earth. That's about what we know about him. And I think Jesus thinks he's that person. He thinks that he is this manifestation of this eternal figure. I don't think that Jesus necessarily believed that he was God, according to the Gospels. I think he thought of himself as being divine, maybe even being elevated to the status of God, but not being a Trinity.
It's interesting. The reason I asked, because I know it seems a little off topic, and that's fascinating to think about. The whole idea that there's this almost ongoing figure that every so once in a while gets reincarnated in some different form or flesh, centuries and centuries apart, if not millennia, is something that if you ask the average Christian, is this in your Bible? Is this in your storytelling? Is this in the divinity of Christ? They would scoff at so hard. It seems like such an Eastern idea or such a demonic idea, however you want to phrase it, anything that's not their particular brand. But the reason I brought it up is I think it's important to try to establish Jesus's thoughts as so far as we can see them through the writers, because if he is someone who thinks he's this Messiah in some fashion, let alone the Son of God, which I hear what you're saying there, we need perfection, right? For what would later come with atonement and all of the salvation models, it can't be any semblance of getting anything wrong ever. If he's just maybe a Messiah in the way that the Hebrew writers would have seen a Messiah, sure, maybe you can account for some level of error. That would still be, I think, pretty problematic. But as soon as we cross over into something more than that, then these failed prophecies of Jesus himself, these failed statements or understandings of Jesus himself, like the ones you've already pointed out, they become ending. It becomes a true putting down of Christianity as we typically conceive of it. So I think it's important to lay that foundation first. So with that understood, the one that's always most interesting to me is, of course, the failed prophecy of Jesus about his own return. I'd love to hear your thought on that. But anything else that you'd like to share about what Jesus got wrong? Because that should be it. If Jesus is the claimed Messiah, if he's perfection, if he's our atonement, if he's our way to salvation, if he's the Son of God, whichever one you want to pick, we can't have this. So let's hear it.
I mean, there's a couple prophecies that Jesus himself, you can tell, is doing the same kind of retooling of. He's of the opinion that you can just go to any text in the Old Testament and say it's a prophecy as long as it sounds like it's about you. So like in John 13:18, he talks about his betrayal. And he's basically indicating there's going to be one of you. It's not all of you. He says, I'm not speaking of all of you. I know whom I have chosen, but it is to fulfill the scripture. The one who ate my bread has lifted his heel against me. So you might be thinking, well, there should be a prophecy about a close associate betraying the Messiah that shared bread with them. But unfortunately, this is a quotation from Psalm 41:9. And when you go to Psalm 41, it actually becomes quite clear that this is not a prophecy. So, and not only is it not a prophecy, it can't be, contextually speaking, about who he's saying is. Like if you go to verse 4, it says, as for me, the Lord said, O Lord, be gracious to me, heal me, for I have sinned against you. Wait a minute. The speaker has sinned against the Lord? Clearly it couldn't be about Jesus. And he says, my enemies wonder in malice when I will die and my name perish, so on and so forth. Then he says, Even my close friend in whom I've trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Well, this is clearly a lamentation of King David. This is not a prophecy about the Messiah being betrayed whatsoever. And so Jesus himself is doing some heavy, heavy reaching, trying to claim that somehow this is about him. And all the prophecies that Jesus states read just like this. They're random, out of context quotations, every last one of them.
It's so sad, almost. Like there's a part of my old past Christian self that's offended at hearing what was held up for so long, right? For decades of this version of perfection, to see not that I would say Jesus is a hero any longer of mine, but to see them fall, because again, it puts him so man-made. If you just took any other messianic claimed figure from this time or a bit earlier, a bit later, and you showed a Christian today, hey, he said this and look, like clearly got it wrong. This is what the Psalm is actually about. They'd be like, yeah, for sure, because he's false. Like they have no problem putting that in its place. And again, for that same Christian, it's one thing to even know that there's contradictions, that the Old Testament's weird, that God is strangely wrathful for what we would expect of an all-loving God. But when you get to their Jesus and you show them that he is so clearly as fallible and ignorant and of his time as the other failed messianic preacher that they don't believe in either, it is soul-crushing to them, which again, not that is an intention here in this conversation or in general, but when you're trying to look for the strongest evidence for someone who is going through that doubt and deconstruction, which is the framing I'm putting all of this in, that is what evaporates it so quickly, which is, I think, why it was one of the last things to go for me. I just refused to let it in. Let's get to the failed prediction of Jesus and how that factors in.
Yeah, there's so many places you can go with the failed predictions of Jesus. I typically start in Matthew 10:23, and some of these appear in Mark as well, but I typically do Matthew because Matthew is more inclusive of the multiple times that Jesus made this prediction. So if you go to Matthew 10:23, we can see the first time Jesus predicted his second coming, and then we'll go to chapter 16, and then we'll go to chapter 24. But in Matthew 10:23, he sends the disciples out to go preach in the villages. And he says, when they persecute you in this town, flee to the next. For truly I tell you, you will not have finished going through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Okay, cool. So before the Son of Man comes, that must mean something. So it's not very descriptive, but we can put that on the shelf. Get to Matthew 16. He says, for the Son of Man is to come. Okay, we got the coming language again, right? He's going to come. It says, come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everybody for what's been done. Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. You're like, oh, this is interesting. Now he's saying that he's going to come with the angels, and he's going to come and he's going to repay everybody. Well, this sounds strikingly familiar to what is said in Matthew 25, verse 30. So if you go to Matthew 25, we have another instance where this is being described. In verse 31, we'll start, when the Son of Man comes in his glory with all the angels with him, then he will sit down on the throne of his glory, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And then, of course, you got the judgment, where the righteous go on to paradise and the unrighteous go to eternal damnation, to the lake of fire that was prepared for the devil and his angels beforehand. So that's what's supposed to happen when he comes with his angels in the glory of the Father. That's the expectation. And so you have to do funny stuff with verse 16 to make sense of it, right? So you would say, well, it says, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. There's a couple things you could do. You can say, well, it's referring to his second coming. That obviously wasn't the case because he didn't come with his angels in the glory of his Father and repay everybody, which is clearly implied in Matthew 24 and 25. So it can't be it. Okay, well, what about John? It's theorized that John saw the revelation. He was alive to see the vision, and therefore it's okay because one of them saw the vision of, the Son coming with the glory of the Father and the angels to repay everybody. It didn't happen in real life, happened in a vision. That's the first goalpost shift. But even this goalpost shift It fails because all you have to do again is just read the text carefully. It says, some standing here will not taste death. Some is never one. Some is always more than one. And it's also not all, meaning some of them must die and some of them must remain. This obviously didn't happen at the time John received his revelation. He was the only apostle alive according to tradition. So some of them will say, well, obviously it's about the transfiguration. The very next chapter is the transfiguration. Cool. Okay. Well, in the transfiguration, famously, he goes up on the mountain, then he's transfigured and he's joined by Moses and Elijah, and they're glowing, and then they come down the mountain. So the first problem, obviously, is he didn't come with the glory of the Father from anywhere. He just walked up a mountain. He didn't come from anywhere. Number two is this was 6 days later. This happened 6 days later. None of his disciples standing there died in those 6 days. Yeah. You can tell even the gospel authors, it sounds to me like this was an authentic, here's my personal opinion. This was an authentic saying of Jesus. There was a Jesus figure who literally predicted that he was the Son of Man coming to do all the stuff the Messiah was supposed to do, and then he was going to do it within these people's lifetimes. He was it. He was the final prediction. And then he just couldn't actually do it because he wasn't the Messiah, because his God is fiction. But it seems to be that was the prediction, because even in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, the long drawn out signs of the ends of days, right? He gives the signs and he says, immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light and the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Cool. That's, dramatic imagery. Could mean a lot of things. But then he says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, thinking Daniel chapter 7, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. There we go. That's what it means to come on those clouds of heaven, just like the next chapter, chapter 25:31 tells you, with power and great glory, he will send out his angels. Remember, he's coming with the angels in chapter 16. With a loud trumpet call, they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So this idea of coming on the clouds, coming with power and glory, happens at the end of days, the second coming, which is why we have the most famous statement from chapter 24, which agrees with Matthew chapter 16, where he says, truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all of these things have taken place. And those things simply did not take place. And his disciples, after he died, believed they were still going to take place, because Paul himself famously, on multiple occasions, predicted that Jesus was coming back within his lifetime. I think 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is usually like the most clear prediction of this. But he says, we believe that Jesus died and rose again. Even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have already died. For this we declare to you by the word of the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have already died. So Paul himself is saying, listen, we're going to be alive when the Lord comes back. Some of you has passed. I know that you're getting worried, but it's okay. Those of us who remain, we're going to be caught up in the air with the Lord. And there's multiple occasions where Paul himself is suggesting that the end of days is imminent. It's coming now.
Half of his advice is under this pretense, essentially, not to start businesses, not to act like you're married. All of these things only work in ensuing apocalypse, essentially. Yeah.
And you mentioned, you brought up a paraphrase from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he's basically telling people, don't even get married. What are you getting married for? He says the present form of the world is passing away. So even if you're married, live as though you're not married. Don't even have kids. And this seems to coincide with Jesus. Jesus famously in Matthew chapter 19 gives the famous teaching on marriage, where he kind of reframes this idea of marriage and divorce. And you can't just get divorced for any reason, only for infidelity, because God was being merciful. Moses was merciful when he said you can get divorced, but this wasn't God's original intention. But then people forget the next paragraph. It says, the disciples said to him, if such is the case of man with his wife, it is better to not marry. And he said to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, let anyone accept this who can. So Jesus himself is saying, being a eunuch for the sake of the gospel for the kingdom seems to be the preferable choice. And why would he think that? Because obviously he and Paul have the same idea. The present form of the world is currently passing away, and you're not going to be doing the deed in heaven. That's why they quizzed him on, hey, whose wife is this going to be since she's had multiple husbands? He's like, you don't even understand. There's going to be no marrying and taking a marriage in heaven. So it seems like Jesus is of this idea that things are ending soon.
Yeah. You mean that whole interaction isn't about a justification for slavery in the Old Testament? Because that's what I always hear it's about. No, that's really interesting. I wanted to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Ann, Boris, Chris, Grant, GVI, Jimmy, Joe, Kitboga, yep, the Kitboga, Matthew, Perry, and Shawn. My Humanist heroes: Chris, Craig, James, Jarrod, and Kristi. My Atheist advocates: Aquitar, Caleb, Dakota, Dan, Drew, Jeff, Jeffrey, Jeremy, Jugs, Julie, Malcom, Paul, Sparky, and Thomas, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. Would you consider joining these fine people?